Thomas Hobbes' 1651 Leviathan, one of the most famous works of political philosophy ever written, still has an incredible power to fascinate, to draw reactions, really through just the sheer stringency of its thought, of the lengths to which Hobbes will take his principles, and the challenge it presents to existing ways of thinking and values. I've just got a few thoughts. This is going to be far from a general introduction to the book, but it might raise some things from the work that you might not have considered. So, notoriously, and perhaps what was most threatening about the work at the time, was the way Hobbes's materialist philosophy, his sort of desire to reduce almost everything in social life and the world down to material causes and effects, ultimately meant that he explained all social interactions in some way or other as being rooted in concerns of power, of the power that could be gained over others, of strategies or tactics to prevent power being gained over oneself. And out of this came his famous description of the state of nature being one where life is nasty, brutish, and short, with greedy individuals only out for their own welfare, and hence the need for them to voluntarily give up their authority, their power, or at least some of it, into the hands of the sovereign, of a king or a parliament, who therefore should be obeyed with absolute obedience in all things, lest the terrible conflictual state of nature returns again, as Hobbes witnessed during the English Civil War. He was desperate to avoid that kind of chaos. And I think what strikes me now is how the sort of threatening aspects of this philosophy, the unnerving thought that perhaps all social relations, no matter how benevolent or seemingly benevolent, are undergirded by interests of power. And this parallels in some ways the speeches of a well-known Canadian psychologist, who I won't name, who has been very concerned with what he calls postmodern neo-Marxists, reducing all of culture to power relations, and his fretting about how that's going to destroy the values of Western civilization, and so on. And yes, in many ways, Hobbes's thought does seem to chime with the writings of someone like Michel Foucault, for whom knowledge is power. And the same concerns in reaction to today can be seen back in the 17th century in, for example, the philosophers, the Cambridge Platonists, as they've become known, thinkers, Christian thinkers, who wanted to defend Platonic ideals of goodness, truth, as almost eternally existing values above material causes and effects. And that's very interesting to look at and to see just the threat they felt from Hobbes's thought. Moving on into the second part of Leviathan, where Hobbes lays out his ideals for a commonwealth, there's been much debate over how much this ties in with the history, the emergence of what some would call capitalism, whether Hobbes's sovereign exists to keep a general peace that's durable enough for the business of commerce and trade to go along its way. And all I'm going to comment on is this thorny issue of whether Hobbes's philosophy is a bourgeois philosophy or in some ways props up the emerging middle classes. And this is a broader issue in Civil War historiography, the Marxist view, as presented by someone like Christopher Hill, would see it being a bourgeois revolution, the emerging merchant middle classes fighting against the old feudal aristocracy. Now, in many ways, that has been dismantled and shown to be untenable as a description. But maybe what points a better way forward is the work of Robert Brenner, whose excellent work, Merchants and Revolution, I think provides a convincing socio-economic interpretation of the Civil War, simply by noting that actually many of the aristocrats had become capitalist, so to speak. They had converted their land into rentable commodities. They had set the ball rolling on the conversion of rural work from being a sort of semi-subsistence kind of life that was dependent on the common lands to one of wage labour. So they had already started to transform the economic system of Britain into one mediated through the market. And for Brenner, this is what capitalism is, the increasing absorption of labour relations into the market, away from sort of semi-subsistence, self-sufficiency of the old peasantry. And viewed through that angle, I think actually a lot of what Hobbes is writing does fit into that picture. Even as he is very critical of the merchant class in his Behemoth, which was his very readable dialogue that explores the history of the Civil War. I think that if we see the emergence of capitalism as being something that was already transforming the aristocracy, not really about the emergence of a new middle class, as it were, I think a lot of what he writes can fit in with that story. And finally, in the third part, about a Christian commonwealth, I think he raises some pretty fascinating problematics in terms of hermeneutics, of understanding of scripture, of the law, because he can make arguments that sound quite like Roman Catholic arguments, where Catholics will say, you know, the trouble with Protestantism is that every Protestant is his own pope. Every Protestant believes they can interpret the Bible in the correct way, and so you end up with hundreds of different groups all arguing with each other, and so on. And Hobbes actually does say things along those lines. But because he is very anti-Catholic, because he thinks the national sovereign should be the absolute sovereign and not the Pope over multiple kingdoms, he basically places that authoritative, interpretative function in the hands of the national sovereign. So his answer to, well, why do we believe that the books of the Bible are canonical, are the correct ones? Well, his answer is, well, the Church of England declared it to be so. as ratified by the monarch. And he is very forthright in saying we just need to believe what the monarch says, even in matters of faith. And to the challenge of, well, what about if you're in a pagan kingdom and you're commanded not to believe in Christianity? Is it right, therefore, to deny the faith then? Among other things, he points to the story of Naaman in the Old Testament, who was healed by the prophet Elisha, but had to go back to his own country, where he would be required to bow down in the temple of other gods. And he says, well, what do I do about that? And Elisha says, well, don't worry. In your heart, effectively, you're worshipping the true God. It doesn't matter if you bow down externally. And Hobbes points to that and says, well, it doesn't really matter what you say, because faith is a gift of God, and if he's given it to you in your heart, that's good enough, effectively. And maybe we might find all of that unconvincing for a number of reasons. But he does highlight hermeneutical difficulties with Protestantism and the political problems they give rise to. And of course, Oliver Cromwell was to find that the squabbles of the various Protestant groups were a significant challenge indeed. So I'm intending to read more into the responses to Hobbes and the effect he had in Britain, and I may well do a follow-up video on that. But for now, I'll leave you with those thoughts and encourage you to look further into him.